Go ahead, Ethan, show them what you think power looks like. The boy didn't hesitate. The slice of cake left his hand in a careless arc, soft frosting catching the chandelier light for a split second before it landed square against Ava Brooks's cheek. A quiet, sticky sound. Then stillness. Conversation snapped shut mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to lips. Glasses hovered just above white tablecloths. For half a breath, no one moved. Then Richard Whitmore laughed. Not loud. Not forced. Just enough to tell the room it was safe to follow. And they did. A ripple of laughter spread across the ballroom, polite at first, then fuller, warmer, as if nothing important had happened at all. Ava didn't flinch. The frosting slid slowly along her jawline, a pale streak against her skin, tracing its way down to the collar of her dark navy dress. She blinked once, steady, and reached for a linen napkin from the nearest table without rushing, without looking down. Across from her, Ethan grinned, pleased with himself, his blazer slightly crooked, a smear of icing on his own wrist where it had slipped during the throw. Claire Whitmore leaned in beside her husband, lips curved in amusement. Kids will be kids, she said lightly, as if the moment needed softening, as if it were nothing more than a harmless joke drifting through a $700 million evening. The string quartet in the corner faltered, then recovered, their melody returning like a careful apology. Ava pressed the napkin gently to her cheek. No sharp movements. No raised voice. Just the quiet sound of fabric against skin. She lowered the napkin and looked at Ethan, not with anger, not even with disbelief, but with something far more unsettling. Disappointment, clean and unhidden. It made the boy shift his weight for a fraction of a second before he forced his grin wider. Around them, the room adjusted itself, people turning back to their conversations, pretending the moment had already passed, already dissolved into nothing. A server stepped closer, hesitant, holding a tray of sparkling water, eyes flicking from Ava to the Whitmores and back again, unsure where permission lived in this room. Ava gave the slightest nod and took a glass, her fingers steady, nails immaculate, her posture unchanged. Thank you, she said softly, her voice even, grounded, as if she were the only one still anchored to something real. Richard lifted his own glass across the table, a casual gesture meant to reclaim control. We were just getting to the toast, he announced, smiling out at the guests, his tone smooth, practiced, the kind that filled boardrooms and closed deals. A little excitement never hurt anyone. More laughter followed, thinner now, but still obedient. Ava raised the glass to her lips, but didn't drink. The reflection of the room shimmered across the surface, crystal lights, tailored suits, polished confidence. She set the glass back down with care, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the table. Somewhere behind her, a whisper moved through the crowd, too quiet to catch, but enough to stir something beneath the surface, like a current shifting direction. Ava reached up once more, brushing a final trace of frosting from her cheek with the corner of the napkin, then folded it neatly in her hand. No one noticed the small detail, the precision of it, the way she refused to leave even a trace behind. She didn't step back. She didn't step away. She simply stood there, calm in the center of a room that had already decided what she was worth, and for the first time that evening, the silence that followed didn't belong to them. Richard Whitmore lifted his glass a fraction higher, waiting for the room to follow his lead, but something in the air had shifted, subtle but present, like a draft slipping through a sealed window, and the applause he expected never fully formed. It started, then softened, then dissolved into scattered clinks of glass against glass, uncertain, incomplete, as if the moment had lost its script. Ava Brooks remained still, her gaze steady not on Richard, not on Claire, but on the boy, Ethan's. Smile faltered for just a second, the kind of crack most people would miss, but not the people who had learned to read silence for a living. Ava tilted her head slightly, not in challenge, not in submission, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if she had just seen something important and decided to remember it. The server who had handed her the water stepped back, retreating into the background where people like him were expected to exist, invisible unless needed. But his eyes lingered on Ava for a moment longer, a silent question hanging there. Ava turned just enough to catch it and gave the smallest nod, a reassurance without words. Then she reached for a fresh napkin from the table, not because she needed it, but because it gave her hands something to do while the room decided how to breathe again. Claire leaned toward Richard, her voice low but not low enough. "We should move this along," she murmured, her smile still in place, polished, practiced. Richard nodded once and set his glass down, the faint sound of crystal on linen cutting through the remaining quiet. "As I was saying," he began, his tone firm now, reclaiming control. "Tonight marks the beginning of a partnership that will redefine." He paused, just briefly, because across the table Ava had finally shifted, not stepping away, not shrinking back, but turning her body slightly, aligning herself with the long stretch of the table as if she belonged there, as if she had always belonged there. A few guests noticed, their eyes narrowing, recalculating, trying to place her. One of the legal advisors near the end of the table leaned toward his colleague, whispering something under his breath, a name, maybe, or a title, something that made the other man sit up straighter. Ava rested her fingertips lightly on the back of an empty chair, her posture relaxed, composed. She did not interrupt. She did not rush. She simply waited, and that waiting carried more weight than any raised voice could have. Ethan shifted again, wiping his hand against his jacket without thinking, the smear of frosting spreading instead of disappearing, his earlier confidence beginning to feel too loud, too exposed. "Dad," he muttered under his breath, but Richard did not look at him. Richard was watching Ava now, really watching her for the first time, something in his expression tightening, not fear, not yet, but awareness, the kind that arrives a second too late. Ava's voice came then, calm, measured, cutting cleanly through the room without needing to be raised. "Before you continue," she said, and the words did not sound like a request. They sounded like timing, like something that had already been decided. The room stilled again, but this time the silence was different, heavier, more deliberate, as if everyone present understood that whatever came next would not be something they could laugh away. Ava let her gaze sweep the table once, not lingering, not searching, just noting, and then she spoke again, softer, but somehow clearer. "I believe there is a detail in the agreement that deserves attention before any toast is made." And in that moment, without changing her tone, without stepping forward, without raising her voice, she shifted the center of gravity in the room, and the laughter that had filled it just minutes ago felt suddenly distant, misplaced, like it belonged to a different night entirely. Richard Whitmore did not respond right away, and that was the first signal that something had gone off script, his fingers resting lightly against the stem of his glass, as if he had forgotten why he picked it up in the first place. The faint hum of the room settling into a low, uncertain quiet. Ava Brooks did not move closer. She did not need to. Her presence seemed to reach the far end of the table without effort, precise and controlled, like a line drawn in ink that could not be erased. "What detail would that be?" Richard finally asked, his voice smooth but thinner now, the confidence still there but no longer absolute. Ava's eyes met his, steady, unblinking. "Clause 17, subsection C," she said, her tone even. "The liability transfer language." A pause followed, not long, but long enough for several heads around the table to turn toward the printed folders in front of them. A few hands flipped pages, paper whispering against paper. The legal advisor who had whispered earlier straightened fully now, scanning quickly, his brow tightening. Ava continued before anyone could interrupt. "It is written to appear neutral, but it assigns full post-closing risk to the acquiring party under conditions that are not clearly disclosed." She did not raise her voice, yet every word landed clean, deliberate, like it had been placed there hours before this moment ever began. Claire let out a soft laugh, dismissive, practiced. "I am sure our legal team has reviewed every line," she said, waving a hand lightly as if brushing away dust, but no one joined her this time. The advisor at the end of the table leaned toward Richard, whispering urgently now, pointing to a line on the page. Richard's jaw tightened, just slightly, his eyes dropping to the document in front of him, scanning, stopping, returning to the same line again. Ava watched without expression, giving him the space to arrive at the truth on his own. Ethan shifted beside his mother, his earlier grin gone completely now, replaced by something uncertain, something he did not recognize yet. His fingers sticky, he rubbed them together absent-mindedly, as if trying to get rid of something that would not come off. That clause, Ava said softly, means if anything goes wrong after the deal closes, your company carries the entire burden, financially and legally. The room seemed to tilt, not physically, but in perception, the balance of power that had felt so fixed moments ago, beginning to slide. Richard looked up slowly, his expression no longer hosting, no longer welcoming, but calculating. And you noticed this just now? He asked, a trace of challenge slipping into his voice. Ava shook her head once, small, calm. No, she replied. I noticed it the moment I reviewed your draft this afternoon. Another pause, heavier this time. The implications settling in before the explanation could follow. Claire's smile faded, just a fraction, as if a light had dimmed behind her eyes. And yet you said nothing. She pressed. Ava's gaze shifted briefly toward Ethan, then back to Claire. I was waiting for the right moment, she said, and there was no accusation in her voice, only clarity, the kind that did not need emphasis to be understood. Across the table, the legal advisor spoke up, unable to stay silent any longer. She is correct, he said, his voice tight, professional. This language is highly unusual. Richard's grip on the glass tightened just enough to catch the light, his reflection warping slightly in the curved surface. The room no longer belonged to him in the same way, and everyone could feel it. Ava let the silence settle again, not filling it, not rushing past it, allowing the weight of realization to do the work for her. And in that quiet, something shifted completely, not in volume, not in movement, but in truth, the kind that does not announce itself, only reveals what was already there. No one reached for their glass now. The champagne sat untouched, tiny bubbles rising and breaking in quiet defiance of the tension that had settled over the table. Richard Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair, not in comfort, but in recalibration, his eyes no longer scanning the room for approval, but locking onto Ava Brooks with a focus that had sharpened into something colder, more deliberate. If that is the case, he said, slowly, choosing each word with care, then perhaps our legal teams should revisit the language privately. It was an attempt to contain the moment, to pull it away from the public space where power could slip, but Ava did not move, did not nod, did not offer him that exit. That would be appropriate, she replied, her voice calm. If this were simply a drafting oversight, the distinction landed softly but carried weight. A few guests shifted in their seats, the subtle sound of fabric against chair backs filling the space where laughter had lived only minutes ago. Claire's fingers tightened around her clutch, the polished exterior beginning to show faint cracks. Are you suggesting something else? She asked, her tone still composed but edged now with something closer to concern than dismissal. Ava turned her gaze toward her, steady, respectful, but unwavering. I am suggesting, she said, that agreements reflect more than numbers. A pause, just long enough for the meaning to settle. They reflect judgment. Across the table, the legal advisor cleared his throat quietly, as if to ground himself before speaking again. We would need to run a full risk analysis before proceeding, he said, directing his words toward Richard but glancing at Ava, acknowledging her in a way the room had not before. Ethan shifted again, his chair making a soft sound against the polished floor. He looked at his father, then at his mother, searching for the familiar ease that had filled the room earlier, but it was gone, replaced by something he did not understand, something that made his chest feel tight in a way he could not name. His hand rested on the edge of the table, fingers still faintly sticky, and for the first time he seemed aware of it, pulling them back slowly, as if the sensation itself had changed. Richard leaned forward now, elbows resting lightly on the table, his posture controlled but no longer relaxed. You are raising concerns at a rather inconvenient moment, he said, the hint of irritation threading through his voice. Ava met it without resistance, without escalation. Integrity is rarely convenient, she replied, the words quiet, almost gentle, but they settled into the room with a finality that no one challenged. The string quartet had stopped entirely now, their silence more noticeable than their music had ever been. One of the violinists lowered his instrument, watching with the same stillness as the rest of the room. Claire glanced toward the surrounding guests, reading their faces, noticing the shift, the subtle distancing, the way attention had moved away from her and toward the woman she had dismissed only moments ago. Ava reached for her glass again, lifting it slightly, not to drink, but to move it aside, clearing a small space in front of her as if preparing for something. The gesture was simple, almost insignificant, yet it carried the quiet authority of someone who understood exactly where this moment was going. Before any celebration continues, Ava said, her tone unchanged, there is one more clarification that needs to be made. And this time, no one interrupted, no one laughed, no one tried to redirect the moment. The room held still, suspended, as if everyone present understood that whatever came next would not simply adjust the evening. It would redefine it entirely. The pause stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, not the kind that people could laugh off, but the kind that made them aware of themselves, of their posture, of where their hands rested and where their eyes should go. Ava Brooks let that silence settle completely before she spoke again, not rushing to fill it, not easing it, simply allowing it to exist until everyone in the room felt it. This agreement, she said calmly, her voice steady and precise, is not between your company and an external investor. Richard Whitmore's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the first real fracture in his control. It is between your company and mine. The words did not rise, they did not strike, they simply landed. And in landing, they changed everything. A ripple moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but immediate, heads turning, eyes widening, calculations rewriting themselves in real time. The legal advisor who had been reviewing the clause froze mid-page, his hand still, his gaze lifting slowly toward Ava with a recognition that had arrived too late. Claire blinked, once, twice, as if her mind needed a moment to catch up with what she had just heard. I am sorry, she said, her voice quieter now, less certain. Your company. Ava gave a small nod, not in affirmation, but in completion. Brooks Strategic Holdings, she said, the acquiring entity listed in Section 1. Richard's hand tightened around the edge of the table. Not enough to draw attention, but enough to steady himself, his eyes dropping back to the document, scanning again, this time not as the host of the evening, but as a man who needed to understand what he had missed. The room seemed to shrink around him, the polished walls, the crystal lights, the carefully arranged tables all fading into the background as the truth took center space. Ethan looked between them, confusion settling into his features, his earlier confidence now completely gone, replaced by something smaller, something uncertain. Dad, he said quietly, but Richard did not answer. Ava continued, not pressing, not forcing, simply laying the reality out in clear, measured pieces, which means, she said, the liability transfer we just discussed would place full exposure on my firm. A soft inhale moved through the room, almost collective, almost involuntary. Claire's posture shifted, her shoulders drawing in slightly, the effortless composure she had worn earlier now, replaced with something more careful, more aware. Then surely, she said, attempting to recover ground. This can be corrected. Ava looked at her, not unkindly, but with a clarity that did not bend. It could be, she replied. If this were only about language. Another pause, deeper now, heavier, because everyone understood what she was not saying. Richard finally looked up, meeting Ava's eyes fully, and for the first time there was no performance in his expression, no social polish, just calculation and something else beneath it, something closer to realization. And it is not, he said, more statement than question. Ava held his gaze, steady, unwavering. No, she answered simply, the word quiet. Final, and in that moment the balance of the room shifted completely, not with noise, not with movement, but with understanding, the kind that does not need to be announced because it is already felt. Ethan's hand slowly lowered from the table, his fingers no longer trying to wipe away the sticky residue, just resting there, still, as if he had finally realized that some things do not disappear just because you pretend they will. And across from him, Ava Brooks stood calm and composed. Not elevated, not triumphant, but grounded in something far more powerful than either, the quiet certainty of someone who had never needed the room to recognize her in order to know exactly who she was. No one spoke immediately after that, the kind of silence that did not come from confusion but from recognition. The weight of what had just been revealed settling across the room like something physical, something that could not be ignored or smoothed over with polite laughter. Richard Whitmore leaned back slowly, not in retreat, but in calculation. His eyes still fixed on Ava Brooks as if trying to reconcile the image he had formed earlier with the reality now standing in front of him. "You should have introduced yourself more clearly," he said at last, his voice measured, controlled, an attempt to regain footing without admitting loss. Ava did not react to the tone, did not mirror it. She simply answered, "I was invited as a guest to your table," she said calmly, "not as a title." The distinction landed cleanly, without accusation, but it left no room for reinterpretation. Claire shifted in her seat, her earlier ease completely gone now, replaced by something more careful, more aware of the eyes around her. "Well," she said, her voice softer, almost rehearsing composure. "Now that we understand who we are speaking with, perhaps we can move forward constructively." Ava's gaze moved briefly across the table, taking in the faces that had laughed, the ones that had looked away, the ones now watching closely, and then returned to Claire. "Understanding should not begin after the fact," she said, her tone still even, still composed, but carrying a quiet firmness that made the words linger. Ethan swallowed, the small motion visible in the stillness, his eyes dropping to the table, to his hands, to the faint trace of frosting that had dried slightly against his skin. He rubbed his thumb against it again, slower this time, as if the act itself had changed meaning. Richard exhaled once through his nose, a controlled breath, then leaned forward again, elbows near the table, posture deliberate. "Let us not lose perspective," he said, his voice regaining some of its earlier authority, though not all of it. "We are discussing a $700 million agreement, not a misunderstanding at a dinner table." Ava met his gaze without hesitation. "They are not separate," she replied, and the room stilled again, because the truth in that statement was not loud but undeniable. The legal advisor shifted slightly, adjusting his glasses, his attention fully on Ava now, no longer divided. "If the acquiring party is Brooks Strategic Holdings," he said carefully, "then any adjustment to the liability structure would require your approval." Ava gave a small nod, acknowledging the obvious without emphasizing it. "Yes," she said, and then let the word rest there, not expanding, not explaining, allowing the implication to settle on its own. Claire's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, her polished composure thinning further. "Then we correct it," she said, more quickly now, as if speed could restore control. "We revise the clause. We proceed. There is no need for this to become something larger." Ava's eyes held hers, steady, unblinking. "It already is," she said quietly, and there was no anger in her voice, no sharpness, only clarity, the kind that does not escalate but also does not retreat. Ethan shifted again, his chair making a soft sound against the floor. This time no one looked at him, no one reacted, and that absence of attention felt heavier than any reaction could have been. Richard's jaw tightened, slightly, the polished calm of a seasoned negotiator still present, but now working harder beneath the surface. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked, his tone controlled but edged now with something closer to urgency. Ava did not answer immediately. She allowed a brief pause, just enough to make sure the room was fully listening. And then she spoke, her voice low, steady, unmistakably clear. "I am implying that how a deal is written," she said, "often reflects how people believe they can treat the person on the other side of it." And in that moment, the connection became impossible to ignore. The contract, the laughter, the silence, all of it aligning into a single truth that no one in the room could separate anymore. And the air, once filled with music and easy confidence, now carried something entirely different, something heavier, something real. The words did not echo, they did not need to. They settled into the room like something final, something that had always been there, but had only just been named. And for a moment no one moved. Not even the servers along the walls who had learned to read tension better than most. Richard Whitmore held Ava Brooks's gaze. And in that stillness something in his expression shifted again, not outwardly, not enough for everyone to notice, but enough for those closest to him to feel the change, the confidence that had once filled the room now narrowing into something more precise, more guarded. "That is a strong interpretation," he said slowly, his voice measured, as if testing the weight of each word before letting it go. Ava did not interrupt, did not correct. She simply listened, giving him the space to continue. One could argue, he added, that business decisions are made on structure, not sentiment. A few heads around the table nodded slightly, relieved to have something familiar to hold on to. Something that sounded like the rules they understood. Ava's expression did not change, but her eyes softened just enough to signal that she had heard this before, many times, in many rooms. Structure reveals intent, she replied, her tone even, not dismissive, not confrontational, just clear. The legal advisor glanced between them, his pen hovering above his notepad without touching it, as if unsure whether he was still observing a negotiation or witnessing something else entirely. Claire shifted again, leaning slightly toward Richard, her voice low but urgent. "We need to stabilize this," she whispered, though the tension in the room carried her words further than she intended. Richard gave the smallest nod, then looked back at Ava, recalibrating once more. "If there has been a misalignment," he said, choosing the word carefully, "we are prepared to correct it immediately." Ava tilted her head slightly, considering, not the offer itself but the way it was being presented, the phrasing, the timing, the absence of something that still had not been said. Ethan remained still now, unusually quiet, his earlier restlessness gone, replaced by a kind of watchfulness that did not belong to him before tonight. His eyes moved from his father to Ava, then down again. The room no longer a place where he felt in control. Ava finally spoke again, her voice steady, her posture unchanged. "Correction addresses the document," she said, "not the context." The distinction hung in the air, heavier this time, because it left no simple solution, no quick revision that could restore what had already been exposed. A man near the far end of the table cleared his throat softly, shifting in his seat, the discomfort now shared rather than isolated. Richard's jaw tightened again, just slightly, the patience of a seasoned negotiator still present, but now carrying strain. "Then clarify the context," he said. And there was an edge to it now, not sharp, but unmistakable. Ava did not react to the tone. She did not mirror it. She simply met it with the same calm steadiness she had carried from the beginning. "You laughed," she said, not accusing, not raising her voice, just stating what had happened, the simplicity of it making it impossible to deflect. Claire's eyes flickered, a brief flash of recognition passing through her before she masked it again. Richard did not respond immediately, because there was no strategic language that could reframe that moment, no clause that could be rewritten. Ethan's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table, the faint stickiness still there, now something he could not ignore. Ava continued, her voice quiet, almost gentle, "And no one stopped him," she added, not looking at Ethan, not needing to. The room absorbed the statement fully this time, without movement, without sound, because it was no longer about the contract. Not entirely. It was about something that had already been revealed, something that could not be adjusted or amended with legal language. And in that stillness, the distance between power and respect, between authority and character, became visible in a way that no one present could unsee. The room did not recover from that statement. It absorbed it, slowly, heavily, like something sinking beneath the surface where it could not be pulled back up. Richard Whitmore exhaled quietly, the sound controlled but no longer effortless, his eyes breaking from Ava Brooks for the first time as he glanced down at the table, at the contract, at the alignment of objects that suddenly felt irrelevant. Claire's posture softened, not in comfort but in awareness, her fingers loosening slightly around her clutch as if she had realized that control could not be held the same way anymore. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because the language they were used to did not fit here, not cleanly, not anymore. Ethan shifted in his seat, slower this time, more deliberate, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him, tracing the faint marks left behind by condensation from the glasses, avoiding the reflection that might show him more than he wanted to see. Ava did not press the silence. She did not move forward to fill it. She allowed it to exist fully, because this was where understanding lived, not in words but in what followed them. One of the guests near the far side of the table adjusted his tie, clearing his throat softly as if to remind himself that he was still part of the room, still present. But no one responded, no one redirected. Richard finally spoke again. But his voice had changed, not dramatically, not enough to draw attention at first, but enough that the certainty beneath it had thinned. "You are suggesting that a single moment should outweigh a formal agreement," he said, the phrasing careful, almost academic, as if reframing the situation could restore balance. Ava looked at him steadily, her expression composed, her posture unchanged. "I am suggesting," she replied, "that a single moment reveals what an agreement cannot hide." The words did not challenge him. They clarified something he could no longer avoid. Claire looked down briefly, her reflection faint in the polished surface of the table, her lips pressing together before she spoke again, quieter now. "It was not meant the way it appeared," she said, and for the first time there was no performance in her tone, no polished ease, just an attempt to soften what had already been seen. Ava acknowledged her with a slight incline of her head, not dismissing, not accepting, simply recognizing the effort. "Intent does not change impact," she said, gently, and that gentleness made it harder to resist, harder to argue against. Ethan's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension that had been sitting there since the moment began, finally visible in the way he held himself, smaller now, quieter, his earlier laughter gone completely, replaced by something he had not yet learned how to name. Richard's fingers tapped once against the table, a small, controlled motion, the kind he used when thinking, when recalculating, when deciding which direction still remained open. "If this is about respect," he said, his voice steadier now, as if he had found a path he could walk again, "then let us address that directly." Ava watched him, not interrupting, allowing him to continue. "We can make this right," he added, and there was something genuine in the statement now, something less practiced, less rehearsed, but also less certain of its outcome. Ava let a brief silence follow, not to reject the offer, not to accept it, but to measure it against everything that had already happened. The room waited, not with impatience, but with attention, the kind that comes when people realize they are witnessing something that will not repeat itself the same way again. Ava finally spoke, her voice low, steady, unchanged from the beginning. "Respect is not something you restore after it is convenient," she said, and the words settled into the space between them, not as a refusal, not yet, but as a truth that would shape whatever came next, and in that moment, the room understood that this was no longer about whether the deal could move forward. It was about whether it ever should have been trusted to begin with. The air did not move, not even with the quiet hum of the ventilation above, as if the entire room had agreed, without words, to hold itself still until something definitive happened. Richard Whitmore leaned back again, slower this time, his posture no longer commanding the room, but negotiating with it, his eyes no longer scanning for control, but searching for ground that had not yet shifted beneath him. Claire sat beside him, her shoulders no longer squared in effortless confidence, her gaze lowered briefly before lifting again, more careful now, more aware of the weight behind every glance in the room. Ethan remained silent, his usual presence reduced to something smaller, something inward, his fingers resting flat against the table as if he had decided not to move them at all, as if any motion might draw attention he no longer wanted. Ava Brooks stood exactly where she had been, unchanged, steady, her stillness now the most dominant force in the room, not because it demanded attention, but because everything else had begun to orbit around it. Richard finally spoke, but this time his voice carried something unfamiliar, not weakness, not defeat, but recognition. "What would you have us do?" he asked, and the question did not sound like strategy. It sounded like an opening, a rare one, the kind that does not appear often in rooms like this. Ava did not answer immediately. She let the question exist, let it settle into the same silence that had shaped everything else. "Tonight." Then she spoke, her tone unchanged, calm, precise. "Nothing," she said, and the word landed heavier than anything before it. Claire's head lifted slightly, confusion flickering across her expression. Richard's brow tightened, just enough to register the shift. "Nothing," he repeated, as if testing the shape of it. Ava gave a small nod. "Because this is not something that can be fixed in a moment," she continued, her voice steady, not dismissive, not emotional, just clear. "And it should not be." The legal advisor lowered his pen completely now, no longer pretending this was a standard negotiation, his attention fixed entirely on Ava. Ethan swallowed again, the sound quiet but noticeable in the stillness. His gaze lifting briefly, meeting Ava's for the first time since everything had shifted, and what he saw there was not anger, not accusation, but something far more difficult to face, understanding, the kind that does not excuse, but also does not condemn. Richard leaned forward slightly, his hands now resting flat on the table, no longer gripping, no longer anchoring, just present. "You are walking away," he said. And this time it was not a question. Ava met his gaze fully. "Yes," she replied. And there was no hesitation, no pause, no need to soften the word. Claire inhaled quietly, the sound almost lost in the space. "Over this," she said, not dismissively, but searching, as if trying to understand the scale of what was happening. Ava's eyes shifted briefly toward Ethan, then back to Claire. "Because of this," she corrected gently, and the distinction settled deeper than anything else had. Richard exhaled slowly, the breath longer this time, heavier, his gaze dropping to the contract one last time before lifting again. But there was no argument left to make, no leverage left to use. Because the foundation itself had shifted, Ava reached for her glass once more, not to drink, but to move it aside again, clearing the space in front of her completely now. A small, deliberate gesture, and then she stepped back, not abruptly, not dramatically, just one step, measured, final, and in that single movement, the room understood what had already been decided. The deal, the evening, the illusion of control. All of it had already ended, not with a raised voice, not with a confrontation, but with a quiet decision that no one in that room had the power to reverse. The step she took did not echo, but it carried through the room more clearly than any sound could have. A quiet shift that marked an ending no one had prepared for. Ava Brooks did not turn immediately. She did not rush toward the exit or gather attention to herself. She simply allowed the moment to settle fully before moving again, as if giving the room one final chance to understand what had just been lost. Richard Whitmore remained seated, his posture no longer commanding, his hands resting flat against the table as if anchoring himself to something that no longer held. His eyes followed her, not with resistance, not with anger, but with a realization that had arrived too late to change anything. Claire sat beside him, her expression no longer polished, no longer composed for an audience, but quiet, inward, the weight of the evening now visible in the way her shoulders had lowered, in the way her gaze no longer met anyone else's. Ethan remained still, more still than he had ever been, his usual presence reduced to something small and silent, his eyes fixed on the table until slowly, almost reluctantly, they lifted. Following Ava as she turned away, her movement was unhurried, measured, each step deliberate, the soft sound of her heels against the polished floor steady and even, not dramatic, not forceful, just certain. The room parted for her without instruction, guests shifting slightly in their chairs, some turning, some lowering their eyes, as if instinctively making space for something they did not fully understand but could not ignore. One of the servers stepped aside quickly, holding his tray closer to his chest, his gaze lowered in quiet respect. Ava passed him with a small nod, the same calm acknowledgement she had carried from the beginning, unchanged by everything that had happened. Near the far end of the room, the door stood open, the hallway beyond dimmer, quieter, removed from the brightness and tension of the ballroom. Ava slowed for a fraction of a second as she reached the edge of the space, not hesitating, not reconsidering, but allowing the transition to register. Behind her, the silence remained intact. No one called out, no one attempted to stop her, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been revealed. Richard's voice almost came, a breath, a shift, but it did not form into words, not this time, not when words would no longer carry weight. Ethan's fingers curled slightly against the table again, the faint trace of frosting now dry, almost gone, but still there, a reminder he could not quite remove. His gaze followed her until she reached the doorway, and for a moment, just before she stepped through, Ava paused, not turning back fully, just enough to glance over her shoulder, her eyes moving across the room once more, not searching, not accusing, simply seeing, and in that brief glance there was no anger, no triumph, Only a quiet acknowledgement of what had been shown, what had been understood. Then she stepped forward, crossing into the dimmer hallway beyond, the light shifting around her, softer now, cooler, the sound of her footsteps fading gradually until they disappeared entirely, and only then did the room begin to breathe again, not with relief, not with resolution, but with the heavy awareness that something irreversible had just taken place, something that no contract, no correction, no apology could restore, and at the center of it all, the empty space she left behind felt louder than anything that had happened before. The silence did not break all at once, it unraveled slowly. Like tension releasing thread by thread, a chair shifted somewhere near the back of the room, the faint scrape against the floor sounding louder than it should have. Someone exhaled, another adjusted their posture, small movements returning as if the room itself was remembering how to exist without her presence. Richard Whitmore remained seated, his gaze still fixed on the doorway long after Ava Brooks had disappeared beyond it, his mind not on the room, not on the guests, but on the moment that had just slipped beyond his control. Claire turned slightly toward him, her voice low, no longer polished for an audience. "We cannot let this stand," she said, but there was no sharpness in it, only urgency mixed with something unfamiliar, something closer to uncertainty. Richard did not respond immediately, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still again, a habit he had relied on for years when thinking through complex negotiations. But this was not a negotiation he could structure, not one he could recalibrate with numbers or language. Ethan shifted beside them, slower than before, his movements careful, as if the space around him had changed, his gaze still lowered, still avoiding the eyes that might now see him differently. "Dad," he said quietly, the word smaller than it had ever sounded. Richard finally turned toward him, and for a brief moment the authority in his expression was gone, replaced by something more human, more exposed. "Not now," he said, but the words carried no force, only distance. The legal advisor cleared his throat again, this time more deliberately. "We need to assess the implications immediately," he said, his tone professional but strained. "If Brooks Strategic Holdings withdraws, the entire acquisition collapses." The statement hung in the air, heavier now, because it was no longer theoretical, it was immediate. Claire's hand moved to her temple briefly, pressing lightly as if to steady herself. "There must be a way to reopen discussions," she said, her voice quieter, less certain. Richard leaned forward slowly, his posture no longer that of a man controlling a room, but of one trying to understand the shape of something he had underestimated. "She made it clear," he said, his voice low, measured. "This was not about terms." Across the table, one of the guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward another as if seeking confirmation of what they had just witnessed, but no one spoke, because there was nothing to clarify. The truth had been simple, direct, undeniable. Ethan's fingers curled slightly again, the faint dryness on his skin catching his attention. He rubbed them together once more, slower now, as if trying to understand how something so small could have led to something so large. His eyes lifted briefly toward the doorway, then dropped again, unable to hold the weight of what it represented. Claire looked at him then, really looked, her expression softening for the first time, the realization settling not just in the room, but within her. "Ethan," she said quietly, but he did not respond, not because he did not hear her, but because he did not yet know how to. Richard pushed his chair back slightly, the movement controlled but final, and stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to break the position he had held all evening. His gaze moved across the room, taking in the faces that had once reflected his authority and now held something different, something more measured, more distant. "This evening is concluded," he said, his voice steady, but no longer carrying the same command it once had. Guests began to shift more openly now, rising slowly, conversations starting again but in hushed tones, careful, aware, the energy of the room no longer celebratory, no longer confident, but reflective, unsettled. And at the center of it all, the absence she left behind continued to shape everything, not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that no one present could ignore, because they all understood, in their own way, that something had been revealed tonight that would not be forgotten, not in business, not in reputation, and not in the quiet spaces where people face themselves without an audience. The room emptied slowly, not with the ease of a finished celebration, but with the careful hesitation of people leaving something unresolved behind. Conversation stayed low, restrained, as if no one wanted to be the first to speak too loudly about what had just happened. Richard Whitmore stood near the table, no longer at its head, no longer directing the flow of the evening. His posture still upright, but his presence altered, less commanding, more contained. Claire moved beside him, her steps quieter now, her attention no longer on the room but on the space between them. "We need to contact her tonight," she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight it did not have before. Richard shook his head once, a small motion, controlled. "No," he replied. "Not tonight." The answer was not dismissive. It was measured, as if he understood that timing had already passed them by. Claire looked at him, searching for the certainty she was used to finding there. But it was different now, less immediate, more reflective. Ethan stood a few feet away, separated not by distance but by something less visible, his hands at his sides, no longer touching the table, no longer trying to wipe away what had already settled. His gaze moved toward the doorway again, then back to the floor, the motion slow, deliberate, as if each glance required effort. One of the remaining guests approached cautiously, offering a brief nod to Richard. "We will be in touch," he said, his tone polite but distant. Richard returned the nod, but there was no follow-up, no extension of conversation, because the usual rhythm had been broken, and everyone felt it. The legal advisor gathered his documents quietly, aligning them with precision before closing his folder, his movements controlled but thoughtful, as if replaying every detail in his mind, not just of the contract, but of the room itself. Claire turned slightly toward Ethan, her voice softer now. "You need to say something," she said, not as instruction, but as a realization, forming in real time. Ethan did not respond immediately, his eyes fixed on a point just beyond the table, his breath steady but shallow. "I did not think," he said finally, the words low, almost lost in the space. Claire's expression shifted, not with frustration, but with recognition, the kind that arrives when something cannot be undone. Richard looked at his son then, really looked, and for a moment the distance between them narrowed, not in resolution, but in awareness. "That is the problem," Richard said quietly, not sharply, not harshly, just stating what had become clear. Ethan nodded once, a small motion, not in agreement, but in understanding, the kind that does not come with comfort, only with clarity. The staff began to clear the tables, movements efficient but subdued, plates lifted, glasses gathered, the physical traces of the evening removed piece by piece. But the atmosphere remained unchanged, heavier than before, as if the absence itself had weight. Richard reached for the contract once more, not to review it, not to adjust it, but simply to hold it. The pages no longer representing opportunity, but consequence. He closed it slowly, deliberately, and set it aside, not with frustration, but with finality. Claire watched the motion, her expression softening further, the sharp edges of the evening replaced by something quieter, something more inward. Ethan remained where he was, unmoving, his gaze no longer searching, no longer avoiding, just present, and in that stillness, the understanding settled fully, not as a lesson spoken aloud, not as something explained, but as something felt, deeply, quietly, and permanently, the kind of understanding that does not fade with time, because it does not belong to the moment alone, it belongs to the person who carries it forward. The ballroom was nearly empty now, the bright chandeliers still casting their steady light across polished floors that no longer reflected conversation or laughter, only movement without sound, the quiet rhythm of staff finishing what the night had started. Richard Whitmore stood alone at the edge of the long table, the contract resting untouched where he had left it, its presence no longer urgent, no longer central, just a reminder. Claire had moved toward the exit, pausing once before, stepping through, her figure fading into the softer light beyond, leaving behind a space that felt wider than before. Ethan remained near the table, his posture no longer uncertain but still, as if the energy that once filled him had settled into something quieter, something heavier. He looked down at his hands again, turning them slightly under the light. The faint trace of what had been there earlier now gone, but the awareness of it still present, not on his skin, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that did not fade with a napkin or time. He drew in a slow breath, then another. Steadying himself without quite knowing why, across the room, a server passed by, collecting the last of the empty glasses, his movements calm, practiced, but his eyes flicked briefly toward Ethan, not with judgment, not with curiosity, just acknowledgement. And for a moment Ethan held that glance before lowering his eyes again, not out of avoidance, but because something in that simple exchange had settled into him more clearly than anything else that night. Richard finally reached for the contract once more, lifting it, not to open it, but to hold it in both hands. The weight of it no longer symbolic, no longer abstract, just real. He looked toward the doorway where Ava Brooks had disappeared, his gaze steady, thoughtful, and for the first time that evening, there was no calculation behind it, only recognition. He placed the contract back down gently, aligning it with the edge of the table as if restoring order to something that could not be reordered. Then he turned slightly, his voice low but clear in the quiet room. "We rebuild from this," he said, not to Claire, not to the guests who had already left, but to Ethan, the words carrying less instruction than intention. Ethan looked up slowly, meeting his father's gaze, and this time there was no defiance, no careless confidence, only understanding, incomplete but real. He nodded once, small, deliberate, not as agreement, but as acceptance of something he would carry forward. The room remained quiet, the last of the staff finishing their work, the final traces of the evening disappearing piece by piece. But the shift that had taken place did not leave with them. It stayed, not in the space, but in the people who had been there, in the way they would remember this night without needing to speak of it. And beyond the ballroom, in the dim hallway where the light softened and footsteps no longer echoed, Ava Brooks walked forward. Without looking back, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, not because nothing had happened, but because everything had, and she did not need the room to confirm it. She did not need them to understand it. She simply carried it with her, quiet and certain, the way she always had. And as the doors behind her closed gently, the last sound of the night faded into stillness, leaving only the kind of silence that does not erase what came before, but preserves it, clear and unspoken, exactly as it was meant to be.